So I brought Dave, a third-generation chippy from Sydney, a man who has built duplexes in Blacktown and renovations in Bondi, to a residential building site in the middle of New Zealand. And within 45 seconds of stepping out of the ute, he looked at me, looked at the site, looked back at me, and said the 5 words that I knew were going to make this video. He said, "Mate, this is the Wild West." And then he pointed at a guy wearing jandals, operating a circular saw, with a dog asleep on a pile of gib. This is Dave. He's my wife's cousin. He flew in from Sydney 3 days ago, and he has not stopped talking about Australian building standards since he landed. To Dave, a building site is a sacred place. It has hierarchy. It has paperwork. It has a site manager with a clipboard and a look that could strip paint. In Australia, Dave tells me, you don't step on a site without a white card, a drug test, a site induction, and a high-vis vest so bright it can be seen from space. There are fences. There are signs. There are rules. So many rules. Today, at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, I'm taking him to a Kiwi building site in a suburb you've never heard of. There are 4 houses going up. There are 6 builders. There is 1 portaloo. And there is absolutely no site induction. Dave thinks he's ready. Dave thinks he knows what he's walking into. Dave has no idea. We pulled up in my ute. Dave got out. He adjusted his hard hat. He checked his safety glasses. He looked at the site, and he froze. Because the first thing he saw wasn't the framing. It wasn't the scaffolding. It wasn't the pile of timber waiting to be cut. It was the footwear. Dave turned to me and said, and again, these are his actual words, "Are those thongs?" I looked over. The site foreman, a guy named Stu, who has been building houses since he was 16, was standing on the second floor framing, wearing a pair of black jandals, holding a nail gun, drinking a cup of tea. Dave's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He said, in Sydney, that man would be fired, fined, and possibly arrested. And here he is, on a roof, in thongs, with a nail gun. Item 1. The footwear situation. Dave walked onto that site like he was entering a courtroom. He had his steel-capped boots laced so tight his feet were screaming. And within 5 minutes, he realized he was the most overdressed person there. Stu was in jandals. The apprentice was in sneakers, with the backs crushed down. The plumber was in gumboots that looked like they'd survived the Falklands. And the guy cutting timber was in socks. Just socks. On wet grass. Dave pulled me aside. He said, "Mate, I'm not being dramatic, but if an Aussie safety inspector saw this, he'd have a stroke." I told him that in New Zealand, steel caps are recommended. But so is common sense. And on a Tuesday morning, when the concrete's dry and the framing's up, common sense sometimes wears jandals. Dave looked at me like I'd just endorsed crime. Item 2. The Smoko shed. Now, Dave is used to Smoko. In Australia, Smoko is a regulated break. 15 minutes. Designated area. Sometimes a lunchroom with a microwave and a notice about hand washing. We walked over to the Smoko area on this Kiwi site, and Dave stopped. Because it wasn't a lunchroom. It wasn't even a tent. It was a shed that looked like it had been built by the apprentices on their first day. Corrugated iron walls, a tarp roof, and a table made from a cable reel with a piece of plywood on top. On that table was a kettle, a pie warmer, a jar of instant coffee that was older than some of the apprentices, and a sign that said, "Smoko is whenever you need it." Dave read that sign. He read it twice. He looked at me and said, "Whenever you need it. Who decides when you need it?" I told him the builder decides. And the builder was currently sitting on a stack of gib eating a pie at 8:45 in the morning. Dave said, in Australia, Smoko is at 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock. By law, you don't get to choose. The government chooses for you. He looked at the pie warmer. He looked at the kettle. He looked at the builder who was now offering him a cup of tea. And Dave, hard-nosed, regulation-loving Dave, sat down. And he took the tea. Item 3. The lack of fencing. Dave walked to the front of the site. He looked at the boundary. He looked at the footpath. He looked at the road. And then he looked at me with genuine concern. He said, "Where's the fence?" I told him there was a fence. I pointed to the orange netting. It was about waist high. It had a few holes in it. It was held up by star pickets that looked like they'd been hammered in by a tired man. Dave said, "That's not a fence." "That's a suggestion." And then, as if the universe wanted to make a point, a neighbor walked past, on the footpath, right next to the site, with a dog and a pram. And she waved at the builders, and the builders waved back. And nobody stopped work. Nobody checked a permit. Nobody called a site manager. Dave watched this happen. He turned to me and said, "In Sydney, that woman would need a hard hat, a visitor's pass, and a 15-minute safety briefing to get within 10 meters of this site. Here she's just walking. Like it's a park." I told him it basically was a park, just with more timber. Item 4. The tool talk. Dave is very particular about his tools. He has a Milwaukee drill set that cost more than my first car. He has a tool belt that has been ergonomically designed by people with degrees. He treats his equipment like a surgeon treats a scalpel. Stu, the foreman in the jandals, walked over and asked Dave if he wanted to borrow a nail gun. Dave said sure. Stu handed him a nail gun that had paint on it, and rust, and a piece of tape holding the casing together, and a sticker that said, "Stu's hands off." Dave looked at it. He looked at Stu. He looked at the nail gun again. He said, "Is this safe?" Stu said, "Hasn't killed anyone yet." Dave pulled the trigger. It worked perfectly. He fired 3 nails into a piece of framing. Clean. Straight. No drama. Stu took it back, wiped it on his shorts, and said, "Good, eh?" Dave stood there for a second. He looked at his own Milwaukee drill. Then he looked at Stu's rusted, taped-together nail gun. And he said, quietly, almost to himself, "Yeah, it is good." Item 5. The dog. Dave was walking around the site, still processing the jandals and the lack of fencing, when he saw it. A dog. Asleep. On a stack of gib board. In the middle of a building site. He pointed at it like it was evidence. He said, Is that a dog?" I told him it was. His name was Blue. He belonged to the builder. He came to work every day. He slept on the gib. He ate the Smoko scraps, and he was, without question, the most senior member of the site. Dave said, in Australia, a dog on a building site would shut the site down. There would be an investigation. There would be a fine. There would be a letter from the union. I told him that in New Zealand, Blue was basically the site manager, and he had never issued a safety violation in his life. Dave walked over. Blue opened one eye. Didn't move. Dave patted him. Blue went back to sleep. And Dave said, and I could hear the resignation in his voice, "He's a good dog." Item 6. The she'll be right moment. We were standing near the second floor framing when Dave noticed something. A piece of timber was maybe 2 millimeters out of alignment. Not much. Barely visible, but Dave spotted it, because Dave spots things. He pointed it out to Stu. Stu looked at it. He looked at his tea. He looked at the timber, and then he walked over, put his hand on it, pushed it with his thumb, and said, "She'll be right." Dave's eye twitched. He said, "She'll be right? That's your quality control?" Stu said, "Nah. My quality control is that the house will still be standing in 50 years. And it will be, because I built it." He didn't measure it. He didn't call an engineer. He didn't fill out a form. He just pushed it with his thumb, took a sip of tea, and went back to work. Dave looked at me. He looked at the timber. He looked at Stu, who was now back in his jandals, walking along a beam with the confidence of a man who has never fallen off anything. And Dave said, "In Australia, we'd have a meeting about that. There would be paperwork, there would be a delay, and the builder would be on the phone to the architect." I told him that in New Zealand, the architect is probably the guy holding the tea. So there we were, 2 hours into the site visit, and something had shifted. Dave had taken his hard hat off. He'd put his safety glasses away. He was sitting on a stack of gib, next to a dog, drinking tea from a mug that said "World's Okayest Builder," while Stu showed him photos of a deck he'd built in Queenstown. And Dave was laughing, not a polite laugh. A real laugh. The kind of laugh you make when you realize you've been taking something too seriously for your entire life. Stu asked him if he wanted to have a go with the nail gun again. Dave said yes. Stu handed him the rusted, taped-together nail gun. Dave fired off 5 nails. They were perfect. And then Dave said something I didn't expect. He said, "You know what? This works." He looked around the site. The jandals. The dog, the orange netting, the cable reel table, the builder with the tea. He said, "In Australia, we have so many rules that sometimes we forget to build the house. Here, you just build the house, and somehow it all works." He paused. He looked at his tea, and then he said, "Don't tell my boss I said that." Dave has been building houses for 20 years. He has certificates. He has qualifications. He has a tool belt that has its own postcode. And today, on a muddy site in New Zealand, surrounded by jandals, dogs, and a level of casualness that would make an Australian safety inspector weep, he found something he didn't know he was missing. He found a place where the rules don't build a house. The builders do. He found a country where a man can wear thongs on a roof, drink tea at 8:45 in the morning, pat a dog on the job, and still, somehow, impossibly, build something that will outlast us all. He called it the Wild West. But by the end of the day, I think he was wondering if the Wild West might actually be onto something. So that's the story. One Aussie Tradie, one Kiwi building site, and a dog named Blue, who may be the most effective site manager in the Southern Hemisphere. Dave flew back to Sydney 2 days later. He texted me this morning. He said he walked onto his site in Blacktown, looked at the fencing, looked at the paperwork, looked at his steel-capped boots, and he thought about Stu. He didn't quit his job, but he did buy a pair of jandals for the weekend. If you want to see where we take an Aussie next, hit subscribe. Because next week, I'm showing an Australian mum a New Zealand kindie, and she's going to ask where the sunscreen station is. Until then, this is Kiwiverse. See you next Friday.